A man wrestled through an entire night with a stranger he could not identify, refused to let go even after his hip was wrenched out of its socket, and walked away at sunrise with a new name and a permanent limp, having asked directly who he had just spent the night fighting, and having never actually received an answer. Everyone who knows the story of Jacob knows the broad shape of this particular night, wrestling with a mysterious figure by a riverbank, receiving the new name Israel, walking away with an injured hip. It's one of the more famous, strange episodes in the book of Genesis, frequently referenced in sermons about perseverance and struggling with God. But almost no retelling sits inside the single strangest detail buried at the center of this encounter. Jacob directly asks the identity of the being he's just wrestled all night, and is refused a clear answer, left instead to spend the rest of his life carrying the physical and spiritual consequences of an encounter he could never fully name or explain, even to himself. To understand why this night mattered so much, and why Jacob was alone on that riverbank at all, it helps to remember exactly what he was walking back into. 20 years earlier, Jacob had fled his homeland after deceiving his elderly, nearly blind father Isaac into giving him the blessing meant for his older twin brother Esau, a blessing secured through an elaborate deception involving goat skins on his arms to mimic Esau's hairy skin, borrowed clothing to carry his brother's scent, and a lie spoken directly to his father's face when asked which son he actually was. Esau, upon discovering the deception only moments after his father had unknowingly given away a blessing that could not be taken back or repeated, wept aloud and begged for some blessing of his own, receiving only a lesser one instead. Esau's fury following this discovery was severe enough that Jacob's mother Rebekah, overhearing her older son's private plans, urged Jacob to flee immediately to her brother Laban's household, warning that Esau intended to kill him once their father died and the customary period of mourning had passed, at which point Esau presumably believed he could act without appearing to dishonor their dying father's household. 2 decades had gone by since that flight. Jacob had married, built a large family, and grown wealthy working for Laban, eventually leaving that household under its own cloud of tension and deception on both sides. Now, returning to the land of his birth with his wives, his children, and substantial flocks and herds, Jacob faced the exact confrontation he had spent 20 years avoiding, an approaching reunion with the very brother he had wronged, a brother whose last recorded intention toward him had been murder. Word reached Jacob that Esau was already coming to meet him, accompanied by 400 men. Scripture describes Jacob's reaction plainly. He was greatly afraid and distressed. This was not an abstract, theoretical fear. 400 men arriving to meet a single family, however large, reads unmistakably as a military escort, and Jacob had no way of knowing whether his brother intended reconciliation or long-delayed vengeance. He divided his people, flocks, herds, and camels into 2 camps, reasoning that if Esau came and attacked one camp, the other might still escape, a decision that reveals just how seriously Jacob rated the possibility of violence. Jacob then prayed, and this prayer is worth pausing on because it reveals a man keenly aware of his own unworthiness even as he pleads for protection, a striking contrast to the confident, calculating man who had once tricked his own father. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. He goes on to remind God of the promise made to make his offspring as numerous as the sand of the sea, appealing to a covenant he had not always honored faithfully himself, invoking a divine promise as his only remaining leverage in a situation his own careful planning could not fully guarantee the outcome of. That same night, still working to prepare for the possibility of disaster, Jacob selected an enormous gift from his livestock to send ahead to Esau: 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, 30 milking camels with their colts, 40 cows, 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, and 10 male donkeys, organized into separate droves with space between each group, each drove entrusted to a servant with careful instructions on exactly what to say when Esau's men encountered them. "This gift is from your servant Jacob, sent to my lord Esau, and moreover, he is behind us." Jacob's strategy was deliberate and calculated, a series of overwhelming gifts arriving in waves, each one softening Esau's approach a little further before Jacob himself ever came into view, hoping the sheer accumulated generosity might appease whatever anger still remained after 20 years. Having sent his gifts, his servants, his wives, his 11 children, and all his possessions across the ford of the Jabbok River that night, Jacob remained alone on the far side, the last preparations complete, nothing left to do but wait for whatever the morning would bring. It's worth sitting with this moment of total isolation. A man who had spent an entire day organizing an elaborate strategy of appeasement, dividing camps, selecting animals, briefing servants on exactly what to say, who had sent every person and possession he had across the river ahead of him, left, finally, deliberately alone in the darkness with nothing left to manage or control, no strategy left to execute, no gift left to send, only the waiting itself. This is where the story usually accelerates too quickly toward the wrestling match itself, without lingering on just how strange it is that Jacob, of all possible moments, chose or found himself completely alone at exactly this juncture, the night before the most dangerous reunion of his life, stripped of every buffer he had spent the entire day building around himself. Almost no retelling gives this deliberate isolation its proper weight before the stranger arrives. This is exactly the kind of overlooked detail Untold Bible Stories exists to slow down for. Stay with me, because what happens in that isolation reshapes everything about who Jacob becomes by morning. Most people can recite the outcome of this night, new name, injured hip, without ever pausing on the actual experience of the fight itself, or the fact that Jacob never once learns exactly who or what he was wrestling. If you want the parts of famous Bible stories other channels rush through on their way to the tidy conclusion, this is exactly where Untold Bible Stories lives. Stay with me, because the identity of this stranger is the real mystery at the heart of the entire encounter, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Scripture offers no introduction, no explanation of where this figure came from, no description of his appearance or his intentions. He simply appears in the darkness, and the fight begins immediately, without preamble, without any recorded words exchanged between them until deep into the struggle. This alone marks the encounter as unlike anything else recorded in the patriarchal narratives. No angel arriving with an announcement, no vision explained in advance, no divine messenger identifying himself before delivering a message. Just a physical confrontation, sustained for hours, between two figures locked in a struggle neither one is willing to abandon. The struggle continued long enough and evenly enough that when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. This detail is worth sitting with carefully. An entire night of struggle between Jacob and this unnamed figure had apparently reached something close to a stalemate. Close enough that the stranger needed to resort to what reads as almost a supernatural intervention, a single touch capable of dislocating a joint in order to finally gain any kind of advantage. Jacob, a man already established in Genesis as physically capable and shrewd, had held his own long enough against this figure that ordinary physical struggle alone wasn't settling the outcome. Even with a dislocated hip, an injury that would leave most people unable to continue any physical contest at all, Jacob did not release his hold. Then the man said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." And here comes one of the most remarkable lines in the entire episode, spoken by a man in what must have been considerable pain, refusing to relent even as dawn approached. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Jacob, having spent an entire life obtaining blessings through deception and manipulation, tricking his brother out of a birthright, deceiving his father through disguise, negotiating advantageous terms with his father-in-law Laban through clever breeding strategies, now demands a blessing directly, through nothing but sheer physical refusal to release his grip from a being whose identity he still did not know. The stranger asked him, "What is your name?" This question deserves closer attention than it usually receives, because it mirrors almost exactly the moment decades earlier when Isaac, blind and unable to verify what he was told, asked young Jacob directly, "Who are you, my son?" A question Jacob had answered with an outright lie, claiming to be Esau in order to steal a blessing that wasn't his. Now, at the end of a night of physical struggle, asked his name again by another figure in a position to grant or withhold blessing, Jacob answers honestly, Jacob, a name that itself carried meaning, often understood as connected to the Hebrew word for heel, or, by extension, deceiver, or supplanter, a name given at birth because he had come out of the womb grasping his twin brother's heel, and a name that had, in the years since, come to describe exactly the kind of man Jacob had become. The stranger's response reframes, "Everything. Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." The name Israel is generally understood to mean something like, "He strives with God," or "God strives," marking this entire encounter, retroactively, as something far more significant than an ordinary physical altercation with an unidentified traveler. This was, according to the stranger's own explanation, a contest with God himself, or with some being closely, enough associated with God that striving against him carried that exact theological weight. And yet, immediately after receiving this explanation of what the fight had actually been, Jacob still doesn't know who exactly he's been talking to. He asks directly, "Please tell me your name." The response he receives is not an answer at all, but a question in return. "Why is it that you ask my name?" And then, Scripture tells us simply, he blessed him there. No name given, no further explanation offered. The blessing Jacob had fought all night to obtain arrives, but the specific identity of the one giving it remains permanently, deliberately withheld, even after Jacob asks for it directly, and even after receiving a new name and a clear theological framing for everything that had just happened between them. A man wrestles all night with a figure powerful enough to dislocate his hip with a single touch, powerful enough to rename him in a way that reframes the entire encounter as a contest with God, and when he finally asks the most basic question anyone would ask after a night like that, "Who exactly are you?" he receives nothing but a question in return, and then silence on the matter for the rest of his life. Subscribe to Untold Bible Stories, because what Jacob does with this unresolved, permanently unanswered mystery is the part of this story that reveals the most about what actually happened to him that night. Jacob's own response to the encounter, immediately after. Receiving the blessing and being denied a name in return is to name the place himself. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." Notice what Jacob does here. Lacking a name from the stranger himself, he draws his own conclusion about who he had just encountered, naming the location Peniel, meaning face of God, and interpreting his own survival of the encounter as a kind of miracle in itself, an acknowledgement that seeing God's face directly was traditionally understood as something no living person could survive. Jacob's own theological conclusion, arrived at without confirmation from the stranger himself, was that he had somehow encountered God directly and lived to tell about it. But this conclusion, however sincerely reached, remains Jacob's own interpretation rather than a confirmed fact handed to him by the stranger. The text itself maintains a careful ambiguity throughout the entire passage, calling the figure simply a man during the physical struggle, then having that same figure speak of striving with God and with men, as though distinguishing himself from an ordinary human opponent, then having Jacob himself conclude he had seen God face to face, all without the stranger ever explicitly confirming his own identity in his own words. Centuries of readers and theologians have continued to debate exactly what kind of being Jacob encountered that night. God, himself in some visible wrestling form, an angel serving as God's representative and thus able to speak with a kind of borrowed divine authority, or some other figure entirely, And the text itself, remarkably, never fully settles the question either way. As the sun rose upon him as he passed through Penuel, Jacob was limping because of his hip. The very last image of this entire episode is not Jacob triumphant, newly renamed and blessed, but Jacob walking away wounded, carrying a permanent, physical mark from an encounter whose central mystery, the actual identity of the one he fought, he never fully resolved. Genesis even records that this injury left a lasting cultural mark beyond Jacob's own body. To this day, the children of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh, a dietary practice observed for generations afterward, a permanent communal remembrance of one man's unresolved, unnamed encounter passed down as ordinary religious observance long after anyone involved that night was still alive to explain exactly what had happened. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that Jacob walked directly from this encounter into the reunion with Esau he had spent the entire previous day preparing for, limping, marked, carrying a new name and an old, unhealed uncertainty about who exactly he had just fought, and walking straight into what could have been the most dangerous confrontation of his life. The wrestling match doesn't function as a clean resolution before the real test of the story. It functions as preparation delivered through injury and unresolved mystery, sending Jacob into his reunion with Esau changed, but not with every question answered, not with full certainty about what exactly had happened to him only hours before. When Esau finally appeared, running toward Jacob with his 400 men, the meeting Jacob had feared enough to divide. His camp and send waves of appeasing gifts ahead turned out to be nothing like what he'd braced for. Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. 20 years of fear, an entire elaborate strategy of gifts and divided camps, all of it built around an anticipated violence that never actually materialized. It's worth wondering, though the text never states this explicitly, whether the man who limped into that reunion, marked, renamed, humbled by an unanswered question he'd carried through the night, met his brother differently than the calculating, deceptive young man who had fled from him 2 decades earlier would have. Jacob's own uncertainty about the identity of his opponent has left readers and theologians debating this passage for thousands of years, and it's worth walking through a few of the most common interpretations rather than settling on a single confident answer, since the text itself refuses to settle on one. Some read the figure as a theophany, a direct but temporary physical manifestation of God himself, taking on a form capable of physical struggle specifically for the purpose of this encounter, consistent with other moments throughout the Old Testament where God appears in ways that interact directly and physically with human beings. Others read the figure as an angel, a divine messenger empowered to speak and act with God's own authority, explaining both the supernatural strength on display and the language of striving with God and with men, without requiring the figure to be God himself in any direct sense. Still, others have proposed more symbolic readings, treating the entire episode as representing an internal struggle within Jacob himself, a wrestling match with his own conscience, his own past deceptions, and his own fear of the brother he was about to face, given physical form through the narrative conventions of ancient storytelling. What almost none of these interpretations can fully resolve, and what the text itself seems entirely uninterested in resolving, is the specific, confirmed identity of the one Jacob fought. This ambiguity isn't a flaw in the storytelling or a gap later scribes simply failed to fill in. It reads, on close examination, like a deliberate choice. A story that gives its central character everything except the one piece of information he directly asked for, sending him forward into the rest of his life carrying a name, a blessing, and a permanent injury, all without the confirmation of exactly who had given them to him. If you've ever walked away from a defining, life-altering encounter without ever fully understanding or being able to name exactly what happened to you, a moment that changed you permanently, marked you in ways others could see, and yet left the deepest question about it unanswered no matter how directly you asked, Jacob's night at the Jabbok is one of the oldest and most honest treatments of that particular kind of Unresolved transformation found anywhere in Scripture. He didn't need the name to be changed by the encounter. He carried the limp either way. If you want the parts of these stories other channels never slow down enough to tell, subscribe to Untold Bible Stories. A new story, like this one, every week. And next time, we're staying with a servant sent to find a bride for another man's son, praying for a very specific sign before he'd even reached the well.